How's that go? London Bridge is falling down. My fair. Oh, there you are. Good day to you, friends. Seamus here. I have a lovely story for you today. And surprise, surprise, it is not a fairy tale. But this is a proper, good old medieval folk story from about the middle of the 1300s in England, of all places. It's called The Story of the Pedlar of Swaffham. And we'll get into it in just a moment, but I'm delighted that you're here today. It's been about a week since I posted, and I think you're going to enjoy this story. So sit back, grab your tea, maybe put your feet up, and we'll go ahead with our story. Story today begins almost 700 years ago in the great city of London. King John's Bridge, the new bridge as they were calling it, was already over 100 years old. It crossed the mighty Thames River. And in the ensuing 100 years or so since it was built, the merchants of London started to get leases along the bridge. And on both sides of the bridge, from end to end, they had built small shops, and the shops got bigger, and they had built living spaces above it. So now both sides of London Bridge was lined with these little shops, merchants on the bottom and their families living up above. And many days away from London, almost a week's journey away to the east, in the little village of Swaffham in Norfolkshire, there lived a peddler, a pack peddler, as they were known at the time. We might think of them like a door-to-door salesman. His job day to day was to sling his big sack over his back and go wandering from door to door and village to village, carrying whatever he could to sell to whoever would buy. He made a moderately decent living, but it was hard work. And at the end of the day, he was only too happy to lay down the pack and set himself down for a bit of a rest. Well, when our story begins, he has had an especially difficult few weeks. He's very tired. It's just about this time of year. Winter is slowly making her way away and spring is beginning to rise. And he sits down one night after his supper on the edge of the bed, just thinking that wouldn't it be lovely if something different could happen in my life. And he laid his head down on his pillow and settled into sleep. Well, he woke up a bit early in the morning, a bit sharp around the edges, because he had had the strangest dream. And in the dream, he had been standing in the middle of London Bridge. Not just a case of somewhere in London where he had never been, but on the bridge, which he had never even seen. He'd only seen pictures drawn of it. But he knew in his dream that it was London Bridge. And he was right in the middle of it, surrounded by all these shops that he had never seen. But what mattered is as he stood there, everything he heard somebody say was somehow good news. He thought nothing of it. It was a strange dream. A little bit of supper didn't sit right, and he went off with his day. Well, that night he got home from his rounds. He had delivered his goods and made the sales that he could, and he got himself in and he washed up and he did his evening chores and he had his supper and he went to sleep. And of course, friends, what had to happen was that he had the same dream again. And waking up on the second morning, he began to think, maybe this means something. No, I couldn't possibly need to go to London. I've never been to London in my life. Why would I go now? And he thought nothing of it. But of course, he went ahead with his day, washed his face, he broke his fast, he loaded his pack and went off to do his work, came back, did his chores of the evening, settled himself in for sleep, and you know what happened. That third night in a row, he had the same dream again for the third night in a row. Even more distinct, he could hear voices. He could see the buildings on the bridge. He could see the full span. He could see the fish swimming in the Thames River. The dream was so distinct. And when he woke up after that third night of dreaming the same dream, he said to himself, that's it. Clearly, something is amiss. I must go to London to find out what this is all about. Strange that a man in his position in society would even dream of traveling that far, but yet he did. So he took that morning, he unloaded his work pack, loaded it in a few extra shirts and a blanket, a few nice loaves of bread that he bought from the local Baxter, loaded in some hard cheese and a bit of sausage, loaded everything up, got himself ready, and before noon of that day, he walked out of his cottage, turned his face towards the west, and started to walk. Now, from Swaffham village to London was just about 100 miles, as the crow flies. But sadly, our peddler was no crow. And he had to follow the King's Road as it wound around forest and over streams and up hills and down hills and through bogs. And it took a full week, 7 days of hard trudging, many miles each day, until finally, late on the seventh day, coming over a small hillock, he looked down on the very edge of the city of London. And given that the sun was already beginning to set and he was quite tired, he laid himself down under the shade of a tree, had a small, simple meal, wrapped himself up in his blanket, and went to sleep. The next morning he rose up, ate a bit of bread, washed his face as well as he could, gathered up his things, and made his way down into the city And without asking directions or knowing what was going on, he made his way directly to the bridge. And walking up onto the London Bridge, seeing all the shops, so many of which that he had never seen, and yet they looked so familiar, hearing the happy chatter of the merchants talking and everything progressing as it normally would, he made his way right to the middle of the bridge, looked over the side, he could see the fish, he knew he was in the right place, and he walked back and forth the length of the bridge, off and on for the length of the day, until the sun began to set, and he never heard a single bit of good news. And he left the bridge and went back to the place he had slept the night before, went to sleep. The next day, he took himself back into town and back up onto the bridge, and the same thing. He walked the length of the bridge, back and forth all day long, stopping often at the middle of the bridge, listening, and all we heard much conversation. He never heard anything that was of particular good news to him. And when the sun began to set and he went back to the same tree up on the hillock, he began to think that he had just been some kind of great grand fool. But just before he went to sleep, he thought, the dream was 3 nights long. Maybe my pilgrimage, if you will, must be 3 days. And the next morning he got back up, made his way down to the banks of the Thames and up onto the footings of the bridge and up onto the bridge itself and walked back and forth all day long. And finally, just as the sun was beginning to set on his 3rd day on the bridge, from the far side of the bridge there came a merchant who had been watching him for the last 3 days. And he came across and he said, "Excuse me, friend, you're not from here." And our peddler said, "No, sir, no, I'm from the small village of Swaffham in Norfolkshire." And he said, "Well, that's a long journey. May I ask why you're here?" And he says, "I'm just here to see the bridge." You're not here to sell anything?" No, sir, nothing to sell." You're not here for a pill?" No, sir, I'm just here. "Well, here's why." And the peddler told the merchant the whole story about the dream, and the merchant began to roar with laughter. "Oh, certainly, I understand. Poor small town nobody. I really understand why. Certainly, I had a dream once too. I dreamt that I left beautiful London and walked all the way to the North Sea to visit the village of Swaffham, where I found a great oak tree and found a mighty treasure. Well, I tell you what, if I was you, I'd be heading off for that." And he walked away laughing. But our peddler stood there and realized that for the first time, somebody spoke specifically about his life. And little did that merchant know that at the bottom of our peddler's garden was an old oak tree, said to predate the days of the conqueror. When our peddler left the bridge, he went back to his tree. He slept the night through, woke up early on the morning, washed his face, ate his breakfast, turned his face towards the east, and made his long way home. Another 7 days of over hills and around forest and through the bogs. 7 days of hard trudging until late on the 7th day, he arrived back at the door of his own fine hut. More than a fortnight has gone by now, getting on to the better of 3 weeks since he first had the dream. And he went in that night and he washed himself and he had a good meal. He laid himself down and went to sleep. And on the morrow he woke up, disciplining himself to keep calm. He washed his face and had his breakfast. And finishing his meal, he took a small spade, went to the bottom of his garden, where indeed by the wall was a decrepit old oak tree. And walking up to the widest space he could find between the roots, he began to dig. And digging down not quite 3 feet, the blade of his shovel hit something solid. Clearing away the dirt, he found a small iron box. And taking the box into his cottage, breaking away the bolt that held it shut, he was not even really all that surprised when he opened the lid and found a small bag of gold coins from the time of the conqueror and a smaller bag with fine stones inside. And he knew that the treasure he had been hoping for all his life had been in his backyard the whole time. He went ahead and underwrote the cost of repairing his village church that had lost its roof in a wicked storm. He helped the widows and orphans in his community, and he lived the rest of his life in peace with the food that he needed and a comfortable hut, never living above his means, but always quick to lend a hand. And he learned the greatest lesson of his life, that sometimes, no matter how difficult things might be, the answer that we're looking for is right in our own backyard. I thank you for joining me today. I bid you all peace. We will see you soon. Until then, take good care. Cheers.